Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey.
Hey.
You can find us online at justonemorefix.com or on Twitter at justonemorefix. If you like us, you can support us at Patreon, and you can give us a rating and review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you find us at. In this episode, we're going to revisit our Vampire the Masquerade city. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix.
I'm Chris from All Things Good and Nerdy, a proud member of the Good and Geek Network, just like the show you're listening to right now. The opinions expressed are those of the individual hosts. Make sure you check out all the other great podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com and get ready, because geekiness begins in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. As you heard, we are going to revisit our Vampire the Masquerade city that we built in episode 45. So that's been some time ago. So if you haven't listened to that one and you're just joining us, you may want to go back to that episode and give it a listen, because we're going to add on to that city and talk about how to fully flesh out your Vampire the Masquerade games and sort of get the ball rolling for a more social and political style game. But before we do that, real quick, we have a couple quick announcements. First off, I want to say a big thank you to everybody that came out and gamed with us at Game in Terre Haute. We had an awesome time. We ran several games for Free RPG Day. We ran 7th Sea, Numenera, Puppet Land.
And that's it.
And then when we got home, Lacey ran Bedlam Hall. But to be fair, I ran 7th Sea and I kind of stole players.
All the players.
Yeah.
So all the players chose pirates.
Initially, yeah. Well, it's hard to say no to 7th Sea.
I did recruit like 3 people for the next session, and
Correct.
They're supposed to bring a friend.
Yeah.
So.
There was a
Bedlam Hall will be happening next month.
Right. There was a large request for 7th Sea. So who am I to say no? And we had a great time running that game. It was a lot of fun. And then Lee ran Numenera, and Kurt brought Puppet Land and ran it for you and Lee. So we had a good time, and big thank you to everybody that came out, as well as a really big thank you to the store and Kira for letting us run games there and hosting us and all that stuff. It's been a great time for us. And also thanks to all the players for being guinea pigs, because we're sort of testing our games for Gen Con, basically, is what's happening there. So in addition to that, we have another one coming up. We're doing this once a month as it averages right now. So if you are in the Terre Haute area, on July 21st is our tentative date right now. We will be running some more games there at Game. And we have plans to also make it to, I'm not sure the name of the 2 stores, but there's one in Mattoon, Illinois that we're going to make it to. And one we have tentative plans to make it to in Lafayette, Indiana. So if you are in either of those 2 areas and you want to come out and game with us, we're working on dates for those. It'll probably be late July, and we will hope to see you there. Do we have any other announcements, or is that it?
Just like on a side note, the group Keep Gaming Indie is running some board games at the Moonshot Game Store in Indianapolis, and that is going to be happening on June 30th, I believe.
Right on.
So if you're in Indiana, you should follow Keep Gaming Indie on Twitter. It is a cool club all about gaming and indie.
There you go.
They have events and stuff.
Very cool. So we ran several games for Free RPG Day, and in addition to running games, we had a very successful Free RPG Day. Carrie and Lee picked up the Unknown Armies Quick Start for me, which I'm excited to run, because Unknown Armies looks very, very cool to me, but I don't know anything about the system, and I want to kind of test the waters before I buy the books, as well as they also picked up the Gumshoe 1-to-1 adventure that came out for me as well. So I'm not sure if that one's for Vivian Sinclair or who that one is for, but everything Pelgrane makes so far I think has been great, so I'm sure it's going to be good stuff.
And Carrie picked up Eldritch Cock from Lamentations of the Flame Princess.
True.
Which James should be getting in the mail for supporting here eventually.
Yes, it should be arriving. I am... It is not here yet. Stupid Finnish post.
And then we are unfortunately not lucky enough to have a gaming store in the immediate area by us that participated in Free RPG Day this year. But I did get a digital copy of Kyle Chenier's Von Bottom's Horde that he was kind enough to list for Free RPG Day. So looking forward to delving into that, because I love all of the wonderful, silly, fun stuff that is the RPGs that Kyle Chenier works on. So.
True story. They're lots of fun. It's a good way segue to see if you haven't seen anything that Kyle has produced before. It's a good way to sort of will get exposed to his style for free. And I really like the stuff that he's made so far, and the games that he's ran for us has been great. So lots of good times and good stuff. Very good.
And speaking of fun, silly, lighthearted games, shall we jump into Vampire the Masquerade?
There we go. Yeah, best segue ever. Right on. I suppose we'll just start this off with how this sort of episode came about. It was sort of a request to continue on from what we did in episode 45. And as things happen with us, sometimes we get sidetracked. We had intended to continue to do more Vampire the Masquerade and World of Darkness content, but got sidetracked and squirrel. And, it happens. And along those lines, I got an email from Australia, from way, way far away Australia. And I'm just going to give you guys I'm going to give a quick shout out to Alex here. And it says, greetings from Australia. Found your podcast recently and have really enjoyed the tips and discussions so far. They're really helpful, and especially the ones regarding Vampire the Masquerade, as I plan on running it soon with some friends. I've GM'd some games in the past, but mostly D&D and Dark Heresy. This is my first time running a more social and political focused game. I was wondering if you had any tips as to how to make the game run smoother, particularly when it comes to political motivations of my players and NPCs. Really, any advice you have on running it would be helpful. Additionally, do you have any other resources for portraits that I can use to give my NPCs a realish face? And he goes on to thank us from there. So big thanks for listening and the shout out there.
I would, off topic, is we're probably not going to, I guess not, it's completely on topic, but we're probably not going to mention it during the actual delve into the episode. But I got some really excellent old-timey photos for you at Joanne Fabrics that came in like a deck style box that had black and white portraits. I would also recommend, if you're short on cash, but maybe you got some pocket change, you could probably hit up your local library. Mm-hmm. Most of them have some sort of genealogy section. You might find not only cool old-timey photos of people, but also of your actual town, if that's where you're running your game. Mm-hmm. And lastly, I would say, I don't know if Australia has like rummage sales, but sometimes you get like old scrapbooks and things like that, right, or like antique stores. Sometimes those can cost you a little extra because they're weirdly collectible somehow, right, or just, whatever, delve into your family's old box of photos. So those are just some quick suggestions. And you can take anything off the internet as long as you're not using it to like make money. So right, look up photos from whatever era you're wanting to use.
So thanks for reaching out, and really appreciate all the praise that you gave us there, Alex. So Lacey mentioned some easy sources for portraits there. I've got a couple other ones. IMDb is a great place. You can find all kinds of actors' headshots that you can use there, both well-known actors and not so well-known actors. And you can print them off and use them. There are, if you're looking for more old-timey photos, if you can find old yearbooks that sometimes people are getting rid of, those work pretty well. And just Googling certain personality traits that you want, and then hitting the images button on the Google search and seeing what you find can turn up some interesting opportunities there.
Something else you might take a quick look at if you have the extra time to put into developing props is how to distress photos. So you can actually print them on like photo paper, and there's some techniques you can use to make them look old.
Right on. All right. Other than that, I don't know, just sort of searching around and that kind of thing. The internet, there's loads and loads of portraits of things, but if you're looking for nice headshots, which is generally kind of what you're going for, I think, in a lot of situations where you're talking about character portraits and whatnot, and IMDb is a great source for it. There was somebody else on a forum that I was talking to somewhere, and they had just basically gotten on there, and it cost a fair amount of money, but they reuse them constantly, and they just printed off something like 150 of different of these small portrait photos, and then they just kept a library of them. Now, obviously, if you're designing a game, you can't use those headshots because that's someone's likeness or whatever. But if you're just using it for your game, it's an easy solution. So, all right on. So, as I mentioned before, if you haven't listened to episode 45, you may want to go back and do that because we're not going to review what we set up there. So, you also I'll probably put an updated version of our notes from what we do in this episode as well. So that'll be listed in the show notes there if you want to take a look there to have something concrete as we go through all this stuff. Just a quick review. The main highlights from that episode 45 is that our city needs to be somewhere local that everyone knows, so it's personal to them. So any decent-sized city that is close to you and that people know. And it doesn't need to be a massive city like Chicago or New York. Just any decent-sized city, whether that's a city that's the size of Indianapolis or something the size of a smaller town like 50,000, 60,000 people. any of those cities will work, but I think the personal touch to it is really what sets things off. As any World of Darkness, that city you're going to turn up the darkness to make it, in fact, World of Darkness. So it's going to be overpopulated. So even if it's a smaller city, you're going to increase it even more to make it overpopulated, densely populated, increase the crime and all that kind of stuff. So the themes that we're going to explore in these games are going to be sins of the father. So that includes your sire. So you are going to be answering for the problems and mistakes and enemies that your sire has made. Nothing in the vampire world is free. So if you ask someone for something, it's always going to come at a cost. And if it comes free, it means it's probably going to cost you twice as much somewhere down the road. One of my favorite ones is death is not the worst punishment. So you live on forever because you're a vampire, and there are always greater consequences than being destroyed. There's lots and lots of great examples of this throughout vampire literature and movies and stuff. So don't use death as a punishment for your characters. There are much, much harsher and I guess evil, more wicked ways to punish that NPCs could punish them and do things to them.
So the overall mood should be one of horror and darkness, emphasis for our particular location on decay and corruption.
One quick note on the horror piece, though, is it's a personal horror. So in addition to being a monster and there's monsters all over the city, it's also a personal horror for you as an individual for what you've lost in becoming this monster and the humanity that you're walking away from as you become a vampire.
So we built into our game and would encourage you to do so some shortages. And so for us, we chose uncontaminated blood, clean blood. So this makes feeding difficult, which always creates interesting dilemmas. Mm-hmm. And the other one is a shortage of jobs and work. So this is kind of like in the mortal realm. So this is something to add struggle to the general world itself.
And that is an important thing because everything that has an effect on the mortal world should have ripple out effects on the vampire world as well. So if there's a hard time finding work, that means that there's more economic depression, which comes along with increased crime, generally increased drug and alcohol use, all the illicit activities come along with that, generally speaking, and all the baggage that comes along with those things. They'll all have ripple out effects on the vampire world. And just like the episode 45, I forgot to do it here. Just a quick warning to you guys out there, if you are sensitive to any of this kind of stuff, World of Darkness is pretty dark, and that's one of the reasons why we like it so much. So it does portray the darker side of reality and turn it up to 11 in a lot of ways. So if that's not for you, this episode may not be for you, because we're going to get into some darker and more adult themes here as we go through and create our flesh out the politics of our city or whatever. So at the same time, incorporate whatever themes or whatever you need in your game, and take out whatever themes that you shouldn't have in your game that your players aren't comfortable with. So World of Darkness is an awesome setting, but there are some pretty dark parts to it. And if you have players that are sensitive to those certain things, you should just take them out and then move on. All right. So I think we're going to focus more on flushing out the politics of our city and then setting it up for our very first game, right? So when we set this up, we built in some innate conflicts into the city. And I think we'll just start from top down in terms of our political positions. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Think that works? Okay. So the top political position being Prince, and we have a Venture Prince in our city. And we left all of our NPCs without names or genders or anything like that. So whatever works for your players, and you guys, if you guys want to use this, feel free to make whatever would be more impactful for your players. Whether that's, I don't know, whether it's anything, I guess, just use whatever archetypes or whatever, or, the looks of the characters, whatever would be more impactful to your players, basically. So our first conflict is going from top down will be our Prince, which is a Venture Prince, versus the Seneschal. So initially it was set up that the Toreador Seneschal they're sort of rivals, and the Toreador has been bought off with this position basically to work for the Prince to sort of make peace in the city, right? Mm-hmm. Now, we mentioned before that the players probably won't be interacting with these characters because they are, very high up socially, but they will be dealing with the fallout of the decisions that these people make, because if you're the Prince, the decisions you make affect everyone, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're in conflict with someone who's also in great power and you're the Prince, it just magnifies from there, right?
Well,
so,
and inevitably your players will be a member of one of the clans
Right.
that is represented in a city position, because generally they're spread out across each of the clans to try and maintain some sort of order of cooperation.
Right. You know what? Why don't we pause here for a minute and back up and set up some ground rules for how we sort of do these things in case you don't want to use our city, right?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
I mean, we built kind of a generic.
Yeah. And that's already kind of in there, but I just want to highlight a couple things, and this is very important to mention for Vampire the Masquerade, because we're doing these episodes in mind that you are new to Vampire, right? And new to World of Darkness. And there are a ton of books, and there is a huge meta plot. And what I will say is it's very interesting and very cool, and at the time Vampire was created, they had some of the best writers in gaming working for them, and they still do. The stuff is really cool and compelling, but there's a lot there. So use or don't use all of it. If you don't want to use any of it because you don't know it, that's fine. Don't feel intimidated by it, because the themes and elements of World of Darkness are really cool, and you don't need to incorporate any of that. And in fact, I've been running World of Darkness games since the mid-90s, and for the most part, I don't use any of the meta plot. I don't involve the antediluvians. I don't involve any of those super powerful elders, because I want to tell my character's story. I don't want to tell the story of Mithras. Now, he might have a cameo in it if we're in London, but the game isn't about him. The game is about the players. And that's always something important to keep in mind, that there are all these powerful, incredibly powerful players, not like player characters, but what's the word I'm looking for?
Methuselahs?
Yeah, all those powerful people that are involved in the world. But ultimately, the game is not about them. The game is about your characters and the players in the game. So while they can be there and doing things, the game should always remain about the players. So along with that, when you set up, we're going to set up all of these political things, right? But none of them are set in stone. They are all flexible. So if you have something that happens in the course of your game for something that hasn't been revealed about the politics of one of the NPCs, but there's something that happens that would make it more interesting to be a different way, then just change it, because no one knows anyway. And if it's more interesting and more compelling for the players for them to be involved and more trouble can come from it, then just go with what they think, what their expectations would be. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
As we move into this, we're going to have the expectation that our characters in this game are cam loyal, and that the Masquerade is important to them, and that we need to have characters with their own individual goals that will plug into this city, right? So your job as the storyteller is to build a fleshed out city with people with motivations that are interesting and compelling, then have the players make characters with their own goals and own motivations, and that can plug into those people that are already involved in the city, and then let the mayhem happen from there, right?
Okay. Goals are important. Conflict is also important.
Yes.
For two reasons. The first, because it's interesting. And the second, because it gives your players strings to pull.
Mm-hmm. Which is important, because there's nothing worse than being in a World of Darkness game where you know there are people who are vastly more powerful than you, but no matter what you do, you just know that my struggle is just ridiculous. There's no reason for me to even struggle. I should just leave. And that's not an interesting game. So you need to
The interesting place is walking the line.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as they start to feel powerful, you want to remind them that they're not. But then you want to give them a moment to shine, to feel like they still have some sort of pull in the world around them.
It's a big moment of managing upbeats and downbeats of your story. So they feel powerful, then they realize, oh no, whatever it was that we just did had a bigger impact than what we thought, and now we're indebted to someone, or now we're on somebody's hit list and we're their enemy now. I think that we have some broad styles of conflict here, and I thought we should maybe set these NPCs in motion as to what they're doing.
I mean, do you do that before your first game?
Yes. Well, the reason being is that way, when you come into game, you have something to plug into, and the city's already in motion. It's not waiting for you. It's already in motion when you come in.
Right, but do you think about what each of these people are doing, or do you think about, here's one problem that's going to happen, let's see how you react to it, and then adjust the city to whatever your reaction was?
Generally speaking, this is what I do. I have like 6 or 7 NPCs here who are the major players in the city, right? And I make very broad strokes of what they are doing. Now, I don't worry about individuals outside of that, like their lackeys. Mm-hmm. Any of that, I don't care about that. I care about the big power players and what the pieces that they're moving, and then that's all I do.
Okay.
We mentioned before that there's this conflict between the prince and the seneschal, right? So how do we set that up? He bought this. I say he. That's just because it's me. But the prince has bought off the seneschal by awarding them this position. So is there a debt that was owed to the prince beforehand, or how did this happen? How did this come about? Like, why? What is it about this Toreador that was so important that they had to be bought off with the position of seneschal?
I think that it's okay for them to owe a favor or this or that or so-and-so's sire, but I like when the mortal world impacts the higher level functioning of vampires.
Absolutely.
And it just so happens that our prince has a lot of his influence involved in the upscale aristocracy of the city, and the Toreador is involved with permits and bureaucracy and also the art community. And you could see how those things would all be needing to work together in order for goals in the mortal world to pan out.
So I think what we're kind of getting at here is that the city won't function without the Toreador saying it goes. Right? Is that what we're kind of setting up here?
Yes.
Okay, so he bought the prince bought the seneschal, bought the loyalty because sort of had to. Mm-hmm. Nothing would work otherwise, and the city's already in enough trouble as it is. So now we have this thing where while the prince is in power, in a lot of ways he's not. And that is the power dynamic that I kind of like the most when it comes to an NPC prince. That on the outside they seem like they held all the power and all the keys to the kingdom, but in reality they're beholden to everyone and don't really have that much power because they're so indebted to everyone to make things run, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we have this weird sort of power dynamic where it's almost inverted, where while the prince is in authority, the seneschal is really the one who pushes the buttons and makes things happen, right?
Yes.
So who would you rather chase down the allies of? Would we rather start on the seneschal side of things or the prince side of things?
I love a good underdog, and I think we should start on the seneschal side.
Okay, very good. So in our city here, we set up the seneschal was allied with the sheriff, our Nosferatu sheriff. So our Nosferatu sheriff, he wants to be the Harpy, but because he's Nosferatu and just the struggle that is got made to be sheriff, that's not the position that he wants, but is allied with our Toreador seneschal. So what does that relationship look like?
I don't think that relationship looks like the whole lapdog sort of arrangement, because our Nosferatu is strong and powerful as a Nosferatu, but he has designs on the position of Harpy, which means he's probably also very wily.
Mm-hmm. A political, social climber.
Yes. So I think that should be a mutual sort of quid pro quo sort of relationship.
Means to an end, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Like, so I can help you and you can help me, and so we're going to work together.
Very good.
I sort of envision our Sheriff Nosferatu, out of all the people, all of the political positions in the city, he is probably the one that you really need to keep your eye on.
Mm-hmm. This is true. As in general, Nosferatu are in the know of all kinds of things and can sort of make or break things by enlightening people to the correct pieces of information. All right, so we'll follow on from the sheriff then. So our sheriff has a tense relationship with the Tremere Harpy. So
for apparent obvious reasons, as the Tremere is currently holding the position that the Nosferatu sheriff covets.
Correct.
Now, again, I don't think this is to say that they're definitely enemies. This is just a tense relationship because I think they're both aware of that. Mm-hmm. But again, our Nosferatu is not just some big bully who's acting as sheriff. He's smart and wily. And so he knows that he's going to need the Harpy to accomplish tasks in the city.
Also, I think that we're setting this up in that...
Plus, you don't mess with the Tremere either.
Well, it looks like we're building a couple hierarchies here. So at the top hierarchy, we have the Prince and the Seneschal, and they are the most powerful in the city, right? And maybe they've been here in movers and shakers for a while, right? And then next tier down, it looks like our Ancilla level characters are the Sheriff and the Harpy here. So he knows this Nosferatu Sheriff knows that this Harpy is going to be someone that I have to either eliminate, or I'm going to, which is unlikely, or this is a person who I'm going to have to deal with for a long time. And it's better to have him be a begrudged rival than an outright enemy. Mm-hmm. So it's this sort of grudging respect that I am a social climber and so are you. And right now our goals sort of align. So we will help each other where we can. Alrighty, so after the Harpy...
No, we haven't really talked about the Harpy.
We
mentioned the Harpy, but we haven't really talked about the Harpy.
So this is where things start to get a little complicated, and that is what will make your city shine. Your alliances and conflicts should never be in straight lines. If you look at our relationship map, there are sort of zigzags and lines going everywhere of I like this person hates me, but I like this person. It's a very tangled web, and that is what make vampire games function, so that when you make one person mad, there is not a clean ripple effect of now all these people downstream are against me. It's this one is against me, this one doesn't care, this one is worried, and there's all kinds of different problems that come from this. So starting in that vein, our Tremere is hopelessly loyal. Is that what it says? Oh, loyal to a fault. Yeah. To our prince. And why is he loyal to a fault to our Ventrue prince? There's always this sort of, not always I should say, but generally the Ventrue and the Tremere are, in most of the games that we have been around, are sort of vaguely aligned together in some sort of way. They may not be complete allies and friends, but they just sort of kind of line up together, first and second state almost.
I would like to make this a very classic I owe you a life debt sort of relationship. And there is actually a life boon in the Vampire the Masquerade system. And so this, to me, buys you not just loyal, but loyal to a fault.
Right. And also, it's important to incorporate the boon system into your games, and that's sort of what makes the vampire economy work. And a life boon is a huge deal, right? It means that this Tremere has to lay down his life for the prince if asked. If the prince asks him to go do something that would very likely result in his death, he has to go do it.
The other reason I like this is because it's going to set into motion the turning of the political tables that I would like to set up later.
Okay, very good. So what? Also, it should make your players realize that life boons are huge things. And if this moment they hear that and they're like, oh, wow, that should be a big impact on them, right? So how is it that what was the life boon? How did the prince save him? Did he physically save him, or did he politically save him, or...
If you want to set that, I'll let you, but I don't think that will be common knowledge to everyone in the city, because the Tremere is the one that is the Harpy, which means they are the only one that has to know about it.
Okay, so I like that. So maybe we set up things to where there's rumors from the old Harpy before the Tremere took over of what it was, right? So let's set up a couple different possibilities that could be rumors that the players could find out about. So I think the first and most clear one is that it's a physical thing. Ventrue are imposing, they have fortitude and dominate and presence and all this stuff. They can be a serious physical presence, right? And Tremere have never been known, nor any wizard should be known for being a powerhouse, right?
I would like it to be something a little bit more ominous as far as my rumor side of the mill goes. And what I'm going to say is that the Tremere was in a significant amount of trouble for supposedly the proof hadn't come to complete fruition,
right?
But that this particular Tremere had led to the downfall of a significant political official in the city, perhaps a clan primogen?
Of his own clan, or?
No, of a different clan. And the piece of evidence that cleared the Tremere's name and prevented the prince from declaring a blood hunt was brought forth by the Ventrue, who is now prince. Now, whether or not that evidence was real or manufactured is up for debate depending on who you ask.
Okay. So I'm going to set mine up to be that the prince has a rumor that he is physically imposing. And that way, if you want to try and declare a praxis, you realize there is this rumor that he may not be able to kill you easily, but he will be a granite wall to run up against. So I think that, so our prince has contacts in upscale and aristocracy level people, right? So I think that we're going to set up that there is some sort of mortal occult society in the city, right? And that there was...
But well-to-do, like a skulls sort of.
Skull, yeah, right, exactly, skull and bones sort of situation. And that maybe, and this can be, you can involve this as much or as little as you want, depending on how much you're familiar with mage or how much you want to involve it, but perhaps there was actually a real mage at the head of this, and that the Tremere was using this group to do things and accomplish his own goals. The prince got wind of it. Meanwhile, there is a third party, this wizard, who comes to destroy the Tremere because, well, without going too deep in the woods about it, there are a group of wizards that are called the Hermetic Order, and that's where Tremere essentially come from. So there's always this feud between the Hermetic Order and the Tremere. So the Hermetic Order gets word of this and comes to eliminate the Tremere. And in true fortitude style, our prince stands there a pillar of iron against the fire and takes the hit for our Tremere friend and destroys the mage. Maybe doesn't destroy him, maybe does. That can be up in the air. Maybe there's this person in the background who always wants to kill the Tremere and the prince that could be a potential ally if the players needed him. Does that seem fair?
Mm-hmm. So there we have 2 or 3 different options you could pick from that, whatever you like, whatever fits your storyline best.
Well, I think it may be best to sow both rumors too, because that's the way rumors work, right?
Yeah.
So, all right. So now we have this not hopelessly loyal to a fault. I'm sorry. That kind of implies 2 different things. Tremere. Now, where do we go from here?
I feel like we hop over to the Keeper next because the Scourge is always in the shadow, kind of. So I feel like we should talk about the Scourge.
Yeah, we sort of intentionally left him out of this to be this sort of whatever you need him to be thing, right? So our Keeper is a Malkavian, and he on here is what?
He is the wild card ally of the Toreador for whatever reason.
What's his relationship to the prince?
It is undefined. He is a neutral party to the prince at this point.
Okay, so we have him down as a wild card ally. So I think that maybe means that he's kind of volatile. It's a common thing
He's
among
kind of Malkavian.
Yeah, among Malkavians. So now he has his own agenda, and he's not completely without thought or purpose, but he is sort of unpredictable in a lot of ways. Maybe our Toreador, since he's used to dealing with artists and the volatility that can come from them, thinks that he can harness that and deal with it, and is overestimating his ability to control this Malkavian Keeper.
I think our Keeper is more than just psychologically unreliable. I think he is just plain unreliable. He's not always there. Sometimes he says he's going to set up the Elysium. You get there and nothing is ready. He's just completely unreliable.
Very good. All right.
In the traditional sense.
So if he is unreliable, right, and we're going to stick with that, then how is it that he has maintained this position?
He's maintained his position because the Ventru prince does not want to give his position to someone else.
Oh, okay.
He is a placeholder kind of until something else comes along, but he doesn't want to fill that position with another political enemy. So he's kept it in kind of this neutral position.
Okay, and then he can't give it to a Ventru because that would be too clearly tipping the tables.
Too much favoritism.
Yeah, tipping the scales one way or the other. Very good. So
it also creates an opportunity for if you have a player that's particularly politically motivated that they could potentially take over that Keeper position.
Yeah, and it gives them something to, not to just take it over, but something to work towards so that they can step in there and show he is unreliable, but I am not. And I could be doing this job. And it gives them something definitely to work towards, right? I like that. That's a good one. That's a good thing to set up there. So they don't they could be social, they could be mental, or they could even be a physical character, and they could all use this as a stepping stone no matter what their archetype is. Very good. Alrighty. Now let me ask this. We have him down as a 3rd neutral own agenda character. He has the hospital, the Knight ED. Does he actually have his own agenda that sort of lurks in the background of all of his what people perceive to be insanity?
I think that he is a legitimate medical doctor and a surgeon. He's sort of like your character from the Victorian age game that I ran.
Oh,
the
yes.
Wraith character.
Yeah.
Kind of grown up in a different era of medicine, and so now some things that were completely crazy then are
not so crazy now,
or vice versa, sorry,
right,
that were not crazy then are completely insane now,
right, plus
add in his own psychosis on top of that,
a
penchant for body snatching anyhow, and I think that he is just more scientifically driven and just not as interested in the politics of the city.
Okay, so I think why don't we set him up then that he has this pursuit of knowledge at all costs, and maybe that's why he's so unreliable. And also, not only is he pursuing scientific knowledge, he's a vampire, right? He knows there is the supernatural as a real thing. So maybe he's also a seeker of Golconda. So he's looking for enlightenment, which is this far off distant thing, but he's been chasing it a long time.
Well,
right?
And I think with that arcane knowledge interest, you can kind of lump in a possible pull with Clan Tremere. So he could have leaning towards the Harpy if you need him to, on account of just that kind of vain wish to know as much as possible.
Right. Well, and he's an interesting card that you can use to sort of fit into anything, because no one really knows what enlightenment looks like, and if you he's Malkavian. It adds this unpredictability, and we've got him down as being even more unreliable than a normal Malkavian. So you can use him to sort of facilitate almost anything you need.
He's like the Cappadocian of Malkavians.
Right. All right, so that's everybody except for our Scourge, right?
Mm-hmm. And our Scourge is a Brujah. And what I would like for the
Hang
Scourge...
on, let me back up one thing before we do the Scourge. So we've set up all these things against the Prince, right? Mm-hmm. So how is it the Prince maintains his power? That's an important thing to have here.
Well, not everything is against the Prince. There are only two parties that are against the Prince. The Sheriff and the Toreador.
Okay.
He has the Tremere on his side, and the Malkavian is neutral. Mm-hmm. Perhaps Clan Ventru is ascendant, and that's how he maintains his power. There are just more Ventru in this city than there are anything else.
Right on. So I'll note that down here.
I don't know if we already had made somebody else ascendant or not.
I don't think we did. I don't think we did, but I think it makes sense that way. That makes
sense to me.
Yes, I agree. Okay, so for those of you that don't know, ascendant means that there are the most of them in the town. So in terms of sheer numbers, there are the most Ventru of any clan in our city here. So now we have our Brujah Scourge, and he is a sort of person who's in the background in the shadows and not necessarily overtly politically motivated. But I kind of like the idea of having him. He has his own political motivations, but they are sort of in the background. Like, people don't think of him as a threat.
Yes. And I also think that he is the oldest person in the city.
Oh, the plot thickens. Right on. So why is it that he is not tipping the scales to be on top?
I believe that our Brujah has lived long enough to know that the people on top are the people that get toppled.
Very good.
And he has no interest in being the person that gets toppled. However, being the person that doles out the king's justice, well, that's a pretty handy position to be in.
So does he have any political machinations of his own?
I think
or aspirations, maybe?
I don't think he aspires to be anything other than the Scourge, and I think that he maintains this neutral appearing position on purpose so that he can pull on whichever person he needs to in order to meet his own ends. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine how it would be beneficial for him to be able to confide in the Prince for something when it comes to assigning what the sheriff's going to investigate. Mm-hmm. And then he has the sheriff's ear when it comes to the investigation so that ultimately the person receiving the justice is the person that he chooses.
Right on. So I also like the idea of him being sort of a more moral figure, and that, you know, you have all these monsters that are set against each other, right? And in order to give them some contrast, it's important to have figures in the game that are, not a lot of them obviously, but some of them that have their own moral compass for whatever that is, right? So maybe he is in fact the Scourge, and you mentioned carrying out the king's justice in so many ways, but also perhaps there are times where he knows that people have been set up and things aren't as they should be, and while in air quotes here, he took care of and dispensed the justice that was to be dispensed, but also maybe set things up and evacuated people out of the city that were supposed to be red listed and blood hunted.
Mm-hmm. I see him more as sort of a classic Brujah,
as the scholarly, monkly style, mm-hmm. Right?
But he is so old, so that makes him a scary enforcer in and of itself, because just the clan disciplines of the mm-hmm. Brujah, on top of being old, makes him nigh indestructible. A machine
of destruction. Right. Now, it is important. We have laid out all these people here, and some of them are older than others. And this is something that should be important for both players and game masters, is that while you are a vampire and incredibly powerful, it is important to not let everyone know of your full capabilities. So while this Brujah is incredibly old and obviously powerful, but people don't perceive that. So he doesn't walk around throwing his weight and his power around in front of everyone so that they know, oh, fear the Brujah, right? He's more of this when there's no one around and he needs to drop the hammer, then the pain is coming, right? Mm-hmm. Right on. Okay. We have our basic city structure set up, and we've outlined more of the politics, right? Now, generally speaking, when I start my games, I don't make any more super big political aspirations for any other characters, NPCs that are in the game other than these. And generally what I do is I have the clans that these people represent, the motivations of the clan generally fall in line with these larger characters, right? Because they're the power players of the clan. Now, there's obviously, when you get down into the weeds, there are people that are dissenting and have their own motivations. But broadly speaking, to simplify things for me as a game master, I just say most people are falling in line with them.
But I have a really fun idea.
Now, this is a perfect example, a great moment where if you have great ideas like you're talking about, we can totally go into it. Those are great, and you incorporate those, but don't feel like you need to flesh out the entire clan. That's what I'm trying to get to. Right. So if you have cool ideas and you want to have a special NPC that's in there that's a dissenting party or whatever and complicates things, that's great. But don't feel like, and I would even say don't do it for every single clan. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Very good. So what's your idea?
Okay. So I would like to topple our political structure on top of these poor neonates that have no idea what to do and leave them grasping for straws to figure out which life raft to grab a hold of so as not to sink. And so I think what has happened is that our Tremere owes a life boon to the Ventrue Prince. Mm-hmm. And if there is anything that Clan Tremere does not tolerate, it is loyalty to a party outside of Clan Tremere.
Okay, very good. True.
And I think that the elder of the Tremere clan has found out about this life boon and is not very happy about it because, first of all, it's loyalty outside of Clan Tremere, and second of all, it's preventing the rise in political power of Clan Tremere. And so I think that while our Harpy Tremere is loyal to a fault to the Ventrue Prince, we're going to put a lot of pressure on this Harpy Tremere and maybe even work behind their back with the elder of Clan Tremere working with our Toreador Seneschal in order to get rid of the Ventrue Prince.
Okay. So let me take what you did and twist it a little bit and see what you think. Okay. So for those of you that don't know, the Tremere have this large power structure of 7 circles of apprentice and all this stuff, right? So a regent is generally a person who is in control of a large city or an area, right? Mm-hmm. So I kind of like the idea that we start the game with what we have here, and then we set this in motion to happen, right? To complicate things. And maybe this works even better if you have a Tremere character in the game. So now this Tremere character is there. A regent from outside shows up, and he comes here because he's heard things, and he knows things are not progressing the way they should, right? And then the Tremere regent will deliver more or less orders to our characters, our Tremere character, right? To set things in motion, find out what is happening. Once they find out why the loyalty is there, their job is to then depose the Tremere Harpy. And that gives them something to do. And it's a larger goal that will take time, and let them sort of puzzle out how it is to topple this political structure, right? And there's always going to be this external force. So if they slow play it, then you just push the gas pedal and the regent says, why haven't you made progress yet? I need updates. I need reports. You need to be doing something. Not that he expects the government to fall overnight, but you need to be progressing. This will also introduce some interesting elements if you have this Tremere character in the game, to where does he tell the fellow players and his coterie about what he's been told to do? And that challenges his loyalty to the clan versus to his coterie. And also he will know that if he chooses the coterie over the clan, he's going to be running afoul of this regent. And then he's posed with a choice: do I side with the regent, or do I come out to the Harpy and say, hey, this dude is here to depose you?
To the prince, you mean?
Or no. Comes out to his clanmate, the Tremere Harpy, and says, hey, the regent has came here and he's going to depose you, right? Mm-hmm. So it sets up these interesting dynamics, because really, in my mind, what makes World of Darkness interesting is all these hard choices to make. Everything comes at a cost, like we said. So it's about, I have choice A in front of me, and it is a 5% chance of death, 60% chance of ascending politically, and 35% chance of being thrown to the gutter. And then choice B is 10% death, 50% whatever. And that's where the interesting part of World of Darkness comes from. And then how do you factor in your allies and your fellow players and all this kind of stuff to it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, because that sounds like it could be something really cool to play through. And also, even if you're just watching it happen at the table, it could be really cool for your players to see this interaction between the Tremere player, the regent, and the Harpy. Mm-hmm. Does that sound cool?
Yeah. This could also work well from other clans that are not those the Tremere. I think you could have a really interesting game as well if you had some Ventru characters. And so they know perhaps our Brujah Scourge is wanting the Prince Ventru to remain in power at this particular juncture. So he catches wind of this plot wherein the elder of Clan Tremere is going to work with the Toreador and Nosferatu to topple the regime of the Ventru Prince. And now the Brujah is in a unique position to be, one, scary, but I mean, the Scourge isn't always known, so I guess it didn't have to, but to recruit neonates, and you say, okay, well, why not people of a higher position? Well, neonates are easy to manipulate, so
True.
he can give them a job that looks like it's not a big deal, but the fallout from that job is going to result in shame being brought upon the Toreador
Right.
or the Nosferatu or what have you in order to solidify the prince's holdings in the city.
Also, if you're a neonate, you're more likely to take risky jobs if you want to ascend. That's how it works, right?
And you're less likely to have the elders of the city pay attention to you. You sort of have a natural level of obfuscate in that nobody cares what you're doing.
Right, and that's an important thing to note when you're running this game, to sort of let your players maybe get away with a little more when people aren't looking, right? But you need to enforce and let them know that when people are watching, they've got to fly right. And then when the eyeballs are off of them, they can get away with a little more, right? And that is sort of that interesting push-pull that exists in the world of darkness. Very good.
So that's a couple different angles. I mean, you can definitely spin it from any clan approach or even pull in multiples very easily with this structure that we've built up, because there's naturally a point where you could bypass this Ventru and everybody could rotate into a new political position and be perfectly happy because, now your Toreador is your prince and your Nosferatu is your harpy and your Tremere is the seneschal. And why didn't we do this a long time ago?
Right on. Now, I'm going to add one last thing to this before we move on, and I generally like to have some kind of an eject button for the players. So it's sort of a third neutral party that they can always go to that comes at a giant cost. So this, in terms of vampire, comes from either a Setite or a Giovanni. So do you have a preference for which?
I think for me, my preference depends on the setting.
Okay, so let me
because Giovanni are just more like, to me, this like sort of businessmen. But if you're wanting like southern area, to me, this the Setite just seems to fit there better. I don't know.
Well,
I'm not really basing that on anything.
I was leaning towards Setite because our Scourge, he already has contacts with organized crime, and I think that we don't want to set this Giovanni up to be a person who's going to butt up against anybody in the city directly. We want this to be an independent person who kind of has their own agenda that the players can go to if they have no other options, right?
Yeah.
So,
and if you have a Malkavian keeper who is interested in arcane occult studies, it seems like a natural thing to have in the city.
So we don't really need to flesh out the motivations of our follower of Set in any way other than he is there, he's self-serving, and he will do whatever he can to increase his holdings, his wealth, and whatever it is that he wants, okay? And you don't even need to make him a player in the power structure of the world other than to say that you mentioned that he's there, and then when the players have no other options, he is there and can help them if they need him, right? So he's a person that they can depend on his silence probably if they need something special, and they don't want other players in the city to know about what's going on or whatever. He's just a wild card that they have access to, but it is always going to be more expensive to go through him because he knows what he is, right?
Now, I will add, if you are someone who's playing a different brand of World of Darkness that is not vampire, and you want to make this neutral third party an NPC that your players have already encountered from another game, that always has a really cool kind of sort of impact. So maybe it's, I don't know that werewolf would ever in any setting work with vampires, but I suppose it's not completely out of the question.
Right.
If the trade-off was right, you always have the mage angle, or what's the other one I'm thinking of? Maybe a mummy. It could be interesting.
Well, no, the mummy,
a demon is, of course, a natural choice.
Yeah. Mummy probably not because you're vampires, but yeah, absolutely. There's lots of different options, and everybody is self-serving to one degree or another in World of Darkness. That's why it's World of Darkness. There are exceptions to all of these things. Werewolves hate vampires, but right, that's why you're playing the game is the but.
Or if you've had another vampire game that was set in a completely different place. Maybe last time you played somewhere in England and now your game is set in Los Angeles, but all of a sudden there's this NPC vampire who has come across the pond and your players kind of know this character on a meta level. It just adds a certain aspect of intrigue that's interesting.
All right on. So I think we have our city pretty well flushed out. And this is about where I get my city built up to play the game. There's one piece other thing that I do, and we have that down already, and that is recent events for the first game. So when the players come into the game, when they make their characters, you need to have them plug into this world and buy allies and contacts that can connect to these things, right? But when we sit down to the table for the very first time, something needs to have happened so that they have something to set them in motion to do whatever it is they want to do. That way, if they don't plug into their goals right away, there's something that they can do and go investigate and go look into, right? So our first one, we have two. So our first one we're going to do is the one that we have here. Okay. So our first one is recent events for the first game, and it's on our sheet here. It is demolition of large buildings in the city. So what I generally do and look at is who is making this happen and who doesn't want it to happen and why does it matter? So we've got these demolitions that have happened here recently. So I'm thinking these are probably like big derelict buildings, old buildings, maybe downtown or old industrial buildings or something. Why are they being destroyed? Not like they failed code, but like the reason behind their being pulled down. What is that?
Well, obviously, our Seneschal Toreador has the most pull in city bureaucracy and permits, and our prince has a strong commercial holding. So for some reason, his buildings are being declared unfit and torn down.
Okay, right on.
It's also a very public slight that he's going to have to answer to, which I think makes it more interesting. Now,
there's a couple different ways this can go, depending on what you want to do or how your players react to it or how you want your NPCs to react to it. But one of the ways is that the NPC prince could say, great, these buildings have been demoed by the city. Now we're going to make them parking lots and I can develop them into something larger. Now that will take time and investment and money and all that stuff, but that's sort of the venture style of comeback to that, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the initial slight can't go unnoticed though, right? That's what this is all about, because sometimes all these vampires are playing the long game, but the initial slight has to be dealt with in some kind of a way. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to murder him or depose him or knock him out of his position, but then there will be some kind of retaliation for it, right?
I like this particular event too because it keeps our Scourge Bruja kind of in the neutral position, right, because he has influence with the local Teamsters union. Mm-hmm. And so he benefits both from the tearing down of buildings and from the building of new ones.
Right. Everybody's happy as long as no one finds John Gotti. Right on. Okay, so we have sort of who made it happen. So obviously the prince doesn't want it to happen, but is there anybody else that doesn't want that to happen?
That doesn't want it to happen?
Yes. Sometimes one of the things that I like to do is find unlikely allies for things. So something that you have this event happen, and very clearly there are going to be people on one side or the other. But then what is interesting is, as both a player, your characters can find these unlikely allies and turn them to their side in ways that may be tangentially related to where they can make it beneficial for someone else, whatever has happened.
I'm going to say that our Malkavian does not want this to happen.
Why is that?
He is oddly sentimental in an old world sort of way.
Yes.
He is a classic historian. And it is just a shame that these buildings are being taken down.
Right. And we already painted him up as a medical doctor. So maybe he delivered a baby in this house. And this is where he...
Or maybe he says he did. Nobody really...
True. Right.
Who knows? Possibly.
Who knows? Maybe he doesn't have any of those skills. He's just a loon. Right on. Okay. So now... the last question I have on here is, why does it matter that these buildings are coming down? Larger than the conflict that is happening politically, right, here with our vampires, why does it matter that these buildings are coming down? Is there something in the mortal world that they're important for or would represent?
In the mortal world, there's already a shortage of jobs and work, and the buildings that are coming down are commercial buildings.
Okay.
And so while that may be creating some jobs for the Teamsters Union, for everybody who's not lucky enough to be a member of the union and know a guy who knows a guy, they're just out the job.
Very good. Perfect.
Also, I suppose you could say there's a large homeless population too, so it's potential you're destroying, non-home homes.
Right, and that draws in our Nosferatu because a lot of their information comes from the homeless and sort of people that are just exist in the shadows, right? So maybe the Nosferatu could be brought into this as well to not want it to happen. Right on. So this right here, what we have laid out so far is exactly how I lay out my World of Darkness games. And before we get into to lay out a second event, the only thing to mention is that you have these are not exactly broad strokes, but they're not super fine details either, right? These are things that can set things in motion, and you have a framework for how the city is going to work and maneuver against each other, right?
Now you have things pulling in either direction. So based on how your players choose to design their characters and how they choose to act, it's very easy to add that leverage one way or the other, whichever way it needs to go.
Right. So when your players make their characters, look at what they have bought on their backgrounds and see how that relates to what is happening in the loyalties in the city, right? Because we sort of painted with some broad strokes what our NPCs' influences are, right? So if you buy Underworld, that clearly puts you either in line or at odds with our Bruja, because that's where a lot of his influence is. And if you buy a cult and all this kind of stuff, it either aligns you or makes you opposed to some of these characters that we've already made.
We mentioned in the last episode about encouraging your players to take allies, contacts, and influence, because this pins them into this web. It gets them directly involved, and you don't have to make them spend that influence or those contacts or those allies in order to give them this information. If they have the rank in whatever area, you can just give them a little tidbit of information.
Right.
It doesn't have to tell them everything that's going on, but it's enough to bait them into taking a closer look at what's going on in that domain.
The other thing that it does is it gives you a way to attack the players and not do physical damage to them. So they're never in any actual physical danger. It's their reputation, it's their influences, their resources that are in danger, but never themselves physically, which is what World of Darkness is really kind of all about, right? All right. So I think we covered how you tie your players into this. I don't know that there's a whole lot more to say about it. So do you want to do one more quick event? I know Alex mentioned on Facebook, in our Facebook group, how his first game went.
This is the event that we're going to use here. So in his first game, his players managed to fend off a Sabbat invasion. The Sabbat are always a natural choice for enemy because it's just so easy. And they ended up burning a chunk of the nightclub district in their attempts to fend them off. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how, at least in our world, that could cause some unintended consequences.
Right, because in my mind, when I run Vampire, that's what everything is about, is unintended consequences and the ripples that fall out from one event, right? One thing to mention here is when we first left the city, we talked about werewolves being outside the city to sort of lock the players in the city, right? They couldn't just leave and go wherever they want, right? Now, Sabbat, I will say, using them sparingly is best because they are the true monsters of vampires. But you don't want to pull on that string or make that your go-to every time, because very quickly your game will descend out of social political importance and very quickly into a black-white Cam versus Sabbat thing, and all we do now is hunt down bad guys and kill them, which basically sort of slides you into more of a
Hunter of the Ring.
a hunter game or a D&D style game, right? Which is what we're talking about, wanting to move away and make a very social and political game here. Now, it is important to note, though, it is fun to bring them in at the right times because it changes things up. So when your game is bogged down in all this politics and social stuff, right? It's fun to just drop a Sabbat problem in there and be like, holy crap, we've got to stop what we're doing. We agree to disagree right now, but we got to solve these maniacs that are destroying and marauding through our city.
It's a unifying factor.
Exactly. So it's great to change pace, but use it sparingly, because if you use it too much, then it's not a change of pace anymore. Make sense? And also, more importantly, if you have a cam game, make your Sabbat vampires monsters, right? That way it sets a clear thing for good guy, bad guy. And then also, if you want to have a sympathetic bad guy in a Sabbat person, that way when you do that, it has impact. They've had 3 or 4 experiences with these terrible monsters that are treating humans like Capri Sun juice boxes and just discarding them everywhere, and no one cares, and we destroy and rape and pillage and do whatever we want. And then when they encounter the charismatic Lasombra, who sort of has this honey
Lasombra
tongue.
is just like the Antonio Banderas of vampires.
Banderas.
Every time you say like Lasombra.
Right. And well, it's great. And then that is the sympathetic villain, but that doesn't work, especially if your players aren't familiar with the tropes of Vampire the Masquerade, unless they've had not one encounter, but at least 2 and probably 3 is even best. And then they meet our Antonio Banderas, Lasombra character, right? And then it has impact. And then you can challenge your characters on a moral level for how do you deal with this guy? Is he really a bad guy? Is he not? But that doesn't work unless you've established them as monsters. So that's my only point here. So we have our Sabbat raid. And what happens now?
So your players have beat back the Sabbat, as maybe you intended them to. I'm sure you weren't planning on TPKing in the very first session. Yeah. I mean, we would certainly accept it if it happened. But so right now, your players are feeling really smug and victorious, which means it is time to teach them a lesson about feeling smug and victorious in the world of darkness.
Yes. There is an important lesson here. The moment you feel like I am on top of the world, you are in fact at the bottom. That's how that generally works.
So what you want to do is take this mayhem that they've created and use it to cause a different escalating problem that is entirely and solely their fault. It's not the Sabbat's fault. The Sabbat did not burn down that nightclub.
Right.
Your players did.
Like, yeah, thank you. You stopped them. But
and you're going to punish them. So the very first thing.
What did they destroy first off?
They destroyed part of the nightclub district.
Nightclub district. Okay. Now, did they destroy a large area or a small area?
It's not specified, but I'm going to go with moderate. We're just going to call it right down the middle. It's not one club.
Right.
Because all these buildings are old. They're probably connected like they are in an old town.
Fire breaks don't work very good as they used to. Stuff burns hot.
So we're talking, like a good, maybe half a city block is now basically completely unusable.
So it's not city destroying, but it's a huge problem and deal. News all over the place, media. Yeah. All right.
So problem first and foremost in the city that we've created is that the public feeding grounds consist of the clubs and the bars and the downtown district. So you have just destroyed a large portion of where everyone can get their food in a city that is already experiencing a shortage of good, clean food sources.
Right. So if you think people were mad before, when now we weren't rationing before, but now we are, right? Which actually, wow. That is something that I never even considered. We've never done in any game. If a prince actually enforced rationing of feeding, that would be a really interesting thing to explore. Oh man, that's devious. Oh, I'm writing that down. All right, I'm sorry. Go ahead. That was like just, I don't know, out of nowhere.
So there are some ways that mechanically we've created food shortages in games before. So I'm going to let you talk about that because I've been more on the receiving end.
Right. Okay. So generally speaking, unless you're playing through actual feeding scenes, we just have it to where you're going to make some kind of a roll. So if you're going to be at the nightclub and you're going to try and seduce people and go that route, you might be rolling an appearance plus empathy or an appearance plus subterfuge. And then whatever successes you get would give you blood points, right? In this situation, though, there's a couple different ways you can handle it, is that you could just increase the difficulty. And if you're going to go feed... Now, if you're only feeding off homeless people, right, the difficulty of your feeding may not be affected by this. So you may be going to the slums or to the homeless shelters and that kind of stuff and feeding off those people, and in which case, your feeding wouldn't necessarily be affected. Or if it is, it might just be a +1 difficulty instead of a +3.
Okay. I would argue, though, that when everybody is having a harder time feeding in one place...
Right.
They start spreading out to other places. And so at least to some degree, your feeding is going to be affected.
Correct. So I think broadly speaking, everyone in the city is feeding at a -1. Okay. Actually, you know what? Maybe we should, I guess it depends on how much pressure you want to put on the players. We already said there's a blood shortage, right? So maybe everybody should already be feeding at a -1. Now the players burn this part of the city down and it increases that difficulty. So now maybe everybody's at -2 unless you're at the rack or the main feeding grounds for the city. And now you're at a -4. I think, -3 might be appropriate. -4 is really, really harsh. But if you burn down half the district, that means half the people aren't there, which means it's that many less people to actually physically feed from, but also you've got all these authorities there now because you've burned this thing down. So there has to be security there to watch the burned down husks of the buildings. There's going to be people doing rehab and tearing things down and cleaning things up. It makes everything infinitely more difficult. But just know that +4 is way, way harsh, because if they botch that, now you have to set in motion things that may cascade even larger. And the idea behind this, at least in my mind, for what we're setting up, is we're setting up events that will make things difficult, but not events that will trip a cascade of events that will destroy everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're going for here?
Yep.
Okay.
So I think the very next thing that you need to think about is who owned the buildings that your players just burnt down.
Right.
And now we didn't entirely specify who owned what. It was said that the prince had some kind of sports bars. So it would certainly be of interest to make these buildings belong to the prince. That's something you could do. You could also make them belong to the Toreador. Toreadors are all about the party. They're social creatures.
True.
So that's a natural thing as well. You could really throw it in any direction that would make your plot the most interesting.
Nightclubs could easily be tied to organized crime and laundering money, which would be the Bruja. They could just very easily be tied to the Tremere because they like money. It could be just, sometimes it's literally just that simple. We have this building. Why? Well, it generates lots of money and we need money, right? And that's, don't make it more than what it is sometimes. Some people that have lots of influence, sometimes they just have this random thing that, I don't know, we've always had that and I inherit it from whatever, and it's just sort of there. Look at your shelves. You have all kinds of odd stuff that's just sort of there for no reason, right? In a very similar fashion.
If you have new players to Vampire, I think the best way to represent this is by giving them placing them in debt to whoever owned those buildings, because they probably don't understand how the boon system works. You can maybe take advantage of them a little bit in a way that makes sense because they are neonates in the town, by giving them maybe a degree higher in boon than what perhaps somebody of social standing would have taken for something of the same caliber. And then you can use that against them later on. It's sort of like a free token to mess with your players later on down the road when you need to set up something interesting.
Now, I want to make one important note here that we haven't mentioned before. The boon system is incredibly important, and it is the economy that the vampire world runs on, okay? So you need to have be not rushing it, but your players need to be accumulating boons and giving them out and that kind of stuff, right? But one important thing to note about boons is that you should not be using the boons that your players give out to people to function as the mysterious person in the corner of the inn that says, I have a job that needs to be done, right? That's not what they're there for. They're there as an exchange of favors for things. Don't use them as the plot catalyst to get your players to go do things, because after that happens for the second or third time, it's not interesting anymore. And now we're just playing the adventure that you have made for us, as opposed to playing a more sandboxy social game with political repercussions and things like that. Does that make sense? So you can totally do that. Just go easy. Not all the time, right? Once, twice, spread it out, and it works really well.
My preference is not to use them to create a whole new mission, but to use them to leverage your players to do something that they genuinely do not want to do.
That is not in their interest. And vampires are described as being devious things. So while you owe me a boon and I'm just a mean person, I might ask you to do something knowing that I probably should ask somebody else to do it. But it's more interesting to watch you run up against people that you probably are your friends and that kind of thing, right? Because I'm more powerful than you and I like manipulating people and I just want to see you struggle.
It's all I have in this world.
Exactly. Very good.
Okay, so I think the third thing to look at is levels of influence and how those can be impacted by the event, and how you can leverage those as a result of what has happened. So what's the first area of influence you would think of when you're looking at a fire?
Well, I think as soon as you start destroying buildings and all the things that come along with them, right? So I think that means that automatically anything that involves the downtown area, the club life, that kind of stuff, those influences are automatically affected in a negative way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean taking dots away from your players, but them taking actions is more expensive. Because Let me talk out of both sides of my mouth for a minute, I suppose, right? So what I said is entirely true. Don't take away dots from your players necessarily, right? Make things more expensive. But at the same time, if the players have done things that are serious and drastic and have massive implications, it is fair to take away a dot of background. It's not something they're not losing experience because backgrounds aren't bought with experience, they're bought with gameplay. So it is fair to do that. Just do that. Know that one has a larger impact on the morale of your player group than the other, right? If you take away dots from people, they're very like, oh no. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's important because you want to drive that point home. And it is less of an impact to their morale if you say this is, will cost you 3 dots of action this session instead of 2, right?
Right.
Okay.
The influence that comes to mind, of course, after the immediate social impact for me would be the impact on your police and fire department forces. Mm-hmm. So just increased work, your guys are going to be tired. And I kind of lump fire in with police.
It's like a first responder
thing. The other interesting thing you can draw on is the fact that this fire is going to spur an investigation.
Yes.
And so whoever has influence over that investigation could make evidence disappear or make evidence materialize, mm-hmm. whichever way suits them best.
And there's also an important distinction for people to know. There are very strict search and seizure laws for police, but when something is on fire, a lot of that goes out the window because now the fire department owns that building. So they can pull out whatever they want and it doesn't matter. And that's how it works. People have gotten in serious trouble because of those things right there. So if you have characters who owned part of a nightclub and maybe they have things stashed there, maybe that their allies and people are in trouble now, also know that clearly some of our NPCs own some of these buildings. So now maybe some of their allies and their lackeys are now in trouble because of what was found in the ensuing investigation of this fire. So I think the next thing you mentioned, the first responders and how it impacts them. So things might be more difficult with them because
so
more
now you're
work
looking
to do.
At hospital or healthcare
Right.
spheres of influence.
Right. So I think the next thing, though, you mentioned the Teamsters and the people that are going to come and rebuild this stuff. So
before you move on, the other thing I would like to mention with healthcare and hospitals that you may not naturally think about is the coroner. If anybody has died in the fire, the person investigating the actual physical bodies themselves will be the coroner.
Really, if it's an important thing to drive home, especially in a vampire world, the coroner in a vampire world is an extremely important figure. And they you can eliminate a lot of problems by controlling the coroner. And if your players haven't realized that yet, drive that point home because it is an incredible ally to have. And it's also fun to say your players think they have control of the coroner, but he'll do what they want to a point, but he's really actually loyal to someone else as well, right? He has, it's good to get paid for multiple people, right? So
now I'll let you move on to the okay. Teamsters and the unions.
So with all this stuff, there's going to have to be more people that come to the city to take care of this problem and to rebuild it and to demo stuff, right? So that means maybe some more increased jobs. So we have more laborers, more Teamsters, more construction workers and all this stuff. So I think along with that being World of Darkness, that ties in our organized crime because that's kind of how you broadly lump those things in this mm-hmm. kind of a setting. And so clearly our Bruja is going to be on the up and up and going to have some more leverage to bring here. There's going to be more money in his pocket. Resources is always a good thing to bring into stuff.
And while that end of things may be going well, your general street crime is probably going to take a hit because where all those backroom deals are happening in the club, you're pawning off, petty cash for drugs. That's not happening right now. And so those venues have been closed down. So I would see that taking a hit.
There's also another interesting thing that happens because of that hit, though. If they have lost ways to make money in certain places, they're going to look for new ones. So there may be areas that they may not have had influence in before in terms of crime and illicit activities that they may be moving into now to try and compensate for what they lost.
The other obvious area of influence that we have not mentioned yet is the media. So exactly what's going on and how the spin is put on that is decided by your media influence. And that fire can get as little or as much attention as whoever has the most media influence chooses.
Now, all this we've talked about, we have left, maybe inadvertently, but the most important piece of this for the last.
The church.
No. I don't really see them as to playing into this piece of it that much. But
obviously, that nightclub burned down because it was a den of Satan.
True, very good. So what I think of immediately, I guess not immediately, but at the end of all of this influence discussion is, was this a breach of the Masquerade? And that is truly the most important question you have to ask. If there are Sabbat there, they don't care about the Masquerade. They're going to throw powers and do what they need to do, and it doesn't matter. But your players should be ever worrisome about those breaches of the Masquerade, because they will have to answer for them, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an important thing to note. Was there a breach of the Masquerade?
And did you participate in it?
Yeah, exactly. And if you did, can you justify it in some way to lessen the punishment? Can you cover it up? Most importantly. So we talk about our media influence there. If you've got the media influence to downplay that to where it's just rumors on the street of some weird thing that happened. But never ever forget that the Masquerade is ever present and should always be a concern. Right on. So this is very dense, and I think we've done a lot here. So there's a lot to absorb, but I think we've laid out basically the foundation of an entire game, an entire city, in some broad strokes and some very direct, detailed ways, right? Is there anything else that you have to add to this here?
I don't know. Nothing's really coming to mind. I feel like we kind of jumped into it pretty good there.
Yeah, no, I agree. This is very detailed. This is a game that I would take to the table very confidently. This is also a game that I would take to a LARP, a World of Darkness LARP, very confidently. And maybe I feel
like we didn't talk exactly about a specific plot that's going to be running in the background. We're assuming that you can handle that bit. I mean, you can come up with something interesting for your players to chase, but all of this background information, all of this kind of monotonous daily tedium that's going on is very important in the background, and it's what gives your story more depth and interest, and it's what makes it a World of Darkness game and not a Dungeons and Dragons campaign.
Correct.
So we know you can hit the plot points on your own. You don't need us for that.
Right. Well,
you may not need us for this either, but we're gonna help you out anyway.
Well, it's an important thing. I emailed back and forth a little bit with Alex, and one of his responses to some of my questions were, "Oh, I guess Vampire is a more player-driven game," and it is. It doesn't have to be, but I think it functions best when it is, when the players are making their own decisions to sort of pursue their own needs and agenda, and that's what we have built here. Now, I will admit, I have ran a lot of Vampire LARPs, and it changed how I prepare my World of Darkness games. So maybe this is a little over preparation for what you're going to do, but this will pay dividends in the end, because you can run a game that will run for years based off of what we have here. Because when you build a game for LARP, you may have 20, 30 players there who need to be occupied by something, right? So no matter what your characters make, you have something to tie them into the game here. And that's what we have tried to set out to do, is that you come to the game table prepared for no matter what they make, you have a way to draw them into your story, and a way for them to be tied into it at multiple levels in complicated ways where there's competing allegiances and no good choices in most situations, right? Mm-hmm. Very good. So let me ask you a couple quick things then. Is this a game that you feel like you would be interested in playing in?
Oh, absolutely.
Very cool. I think it's very cool. I know we mentioned this in the past episodes before, but I think we're going to keep fleshing this out as we go. And whatever other Vampire the Masquerade content we create will be sort of based around this city that we have created here, because I think it's more interesting to continue to build and add to something than it is to create 1,000 small things. So
I would encourage people, if they're having difficulty with the development of this, and maybe they don't just want to take what we've said and steal that directly,
which is okay
you
if you do.
Welcome to do.
Absolutely.
Do. I think Microscope, the RPG, would be excellent for the creation of a World of Darkness game.
Yeah.
Particularly Vampire, or maybe even Mage, because you're talking about NPCs that have been around for centuries.
Yeah.
And that game is designed to create a in-depth, rich history. And it's definitely, it's not a costly RPG. So if you feel like that's something you could use some work and practice doing, I really think you could find some helpful, useful information there.
Very cool.
So that's my aside.
I know we sort of recapped a little bit of what we talked about in the previous episode, but I want to mention real quick a couple of sources of inspiration. Is that The Crow is the sort of the look of the city that we were going for, because I cannot talk about World of Darkness without mentioning The Crow. If you haven't seen it, the very first original one with Brandon Lee, it is a phenomenal movie, and the city is in flames. It's always this sort of wet and dark and dirty.
Sin City is another similar feel.
Now, in that one, you're looking more for the look and the feel of things, not necessarily the pulpiness of the story, but the look of it is right on that sort of dark, black and white noir feel, I feel like. Anne Rice stuff for obviously vampire inspiration, Game of Thrones for politics, House of Cards for politics, The Borgias for politics, True Blood for, I guess, all of it, right? Maybe that one's a little softer sometimes than how the vampires that I like to portray, but I like them to be a little...
Well, depending on the book you're talking about, Anne Rice can be a little bit that way too. Just
yeah, that's true. That's true.
Maybe not quite as much, but it's similar, moderate politics, high sexual intercourse.
Well, that is a big part of the vampire trope, though, is seduction and all of that that comes along with
power
it.
And seduction.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we will probably take our notes here and formalize them a little bit better and generate something that we'll put up on our Patreon here very soon.
There's also, you didn't mention it, but there is a whole series of World of Darkness novels.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, then they're very well written. They're very good. They're a little harder to find now, but they're on, I believe, Drive-Thru Fiction has them all, but you can generally find them at used bookstores and that kind of stuff, and they're pretty good as well if you're looking for what some of the meta plot or how the designers intended the world to sort of look and feel. So,
but they're written, they're just like stories.
Yeah,
they're not.
Yeah. Yep. And they're very good, though.
How-to manuals.
Right. Yeah. So, like I said, we will be formalizing this a little bit better and probably putting this up on our Patreon very soon. And our trauma table is completed in terms of layout. It has to have a few
final touches
needed, but it should be done within the next couple of days here. The hard part, the layout of it, is actually completely done. Just have to edit and fill in some more text. So stuff coming up there very soon. This Friday, we should have our release of our next Night Witches episode, which will be the first episode of our third session. And if you haven't been listening to that one, it's where things really ratchet up and there's some very intense moments as our female pilots have crash landed, I suppose, successfully, and there's some trouble and drama to ensue from that and serious consequences. So check that out. That'll be out this coming Friday. And if you also back us on Patreon, all of the edited episodes for Actual Plays go up right away as soon as I have them done. And they normally release one every other week, every other Friday. So I think that'll do it for us this week. Hopefully you guys will enjoy some vampire and this has helped you out in some ways. And I know we focus on vampire a lot here, but this could apply to any political game, because while World of Darkness is very specific, the tropes that we talk about are in every story essentially, right? So just take whatever the clan is and apply that trope to that sort of mortal character type, and you're good to go.
If you're a history buff, you could probably take an entire century of monarchy and just cut the names and change it around, and your players may never know the difference.
But that's actually what Game of Thrones is in a lot of ways. It's the War of the Roses with the names filed off, and it's still great.
I know what you're talking about.
I don't mind it at all. So right on. Well, I think that'll do it for us this week. Hopefully you guys got some useful out of this. Hopefully we'll see you guys at Game in Terre Haute or at the game store that we're going to run out in Hoopeston and Lafayette. We'll be Hoopeston. Whoops. At the game store in Mattoon or in Lafayette when we get up there at the end of this month. We'll be blasting those out on our Facebook and on our Twitter as well. We're looking to be more active there on Facebook, so... Quick Gonna Geek promo for On the Bubble podcast. Angel will follow Angel to Hell or another network. Josh breaks down the Save Our Shows campaign that launched in April 2004 to save Joss Whedon's cult classic Angel, a campaign that included a load of chocolate bars, public rallies, and food drives, and even a billboard truck. So check that out. That's On the Bubble podcast on the Gonna Geek Network. I think that'll do it for us, and we will see you guys next week. Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can support us at patreon.com/JustOneMoreFix or follow us on Twitter at JustOneMoreFix.